it does reflect what I've been hearing up and down the country from church leaders saying, we're just seeing a lot of young guys turning up. They maybe read the Bible, they've maybe just bumped into videos by Jordan Peterson, they've got all these questions, but they're looking for something and they're turning up in church. And it's the demographic that traditionally has been most absent from churches, interestingly. So it's a really, really interesting new thing that's happened.
Hello and welcome to Spectator TV and happy Holy Week. Easter is fast approaching, Easter Sunday. We have an Easter special issue out now. It's a very beautiful cover which has a cryptic code in it that is almost impossible to decipher, but I think some people are getting close. The winner, I understand, gets a bottle of Pol Roger that could be drunk after Lent is over. There are reports, the Bible Society has produced some interesting findings, that there is a small, though nonetheless significant revival of churchgoers, particularly among the young and particularly among young men. To discuss this possible trend, I'm delighted to be joined by Justin Brierley, who is an author and broadcaster. Justin, you've written about this for us before, and I slightly feel, and I don't mean this to come across too cynically, but this is something that Christians often hope is happening and have done for a long time, but really the general pattern, if we look at it, is one of quite serious decline.
Yes, you're absolutely right. There's no doubt that through the 20th and early 21st century, there's just been a steep decline of church-going religiosity, not only in the UK, but in the West generally. So when I wrote an article for The Spectator for last year's Easter edition, which was given the title, A Christian Revival is Underway in the UK, a lot of people naturally said, what are you talking about? There's absolutely no statistical evidence for it. You may have a few interesting anecdotes about, some interesting secular intellectuals talking more enthusiastically about faith, but is there any actual statistical data? Interestingly, I think what we're seeing now is that data starting to come in, and that sense I had that the God was back on the table in public conversation seems to be borne out by the fact people are actually walking back into church now.
And it's interesting that these latest findings are that young people and young men in particular, there's a lot of talk about young men, particularly to do with the internet. You hear a lot about Andrew Tate being this toxic male influencer. You hear a lot about men not having a sense of identity and so on. The TV show Adolescence has been turned into a kind of national saga all by itself. Why do you think young men might be turning towards Christianity? Is it a search for identity and meaning?
I think that's definitely a big part of it. Funnily enough, in my book, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, sort of looked at this change in culture around the God question. And my podcast series is just about, of the same name, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, is about to release 2 episodes on this male identity crisis and the fact that it appears young men are returning at some level back to church. And I think absolutely that meaning, that identity, that sense of purpose that I think is lacking in a lot of young men's lives. And I think it is partly because young men don't know what it means to be a man today. The word masculinity has often been attached to the word toxic. We've been told kind of what you're not allowed to be, but we haven't really been told what you are allowed to be as a man in our culture. And that's opened the door for a lot of these, negative influences, the Andrew Tates and so on, to come along. But I don't think it's all a bad story. I think that it's also kind of opened the door to faith, to church for a lot of young men. And I think that's because church and the Christian story sort of does provide a kind of sense of stability. It often provides a sense of structure, especially the more traditional forms of church going, the Orthodox Church, the Catholic rites. They provide a sort of a place in which young men can say, okay, here's something stable, something that's got deep foundations. And I think it provides the possibility of wiser, older male mentors, which are often missing, frankly, in a lot of young men's lives. And so I think that's all part of the attraction for why we are seeing this interesting upturn. The statistics are quite phenomenal, Freddie. That, like this Bible Society Quiet Revival report, it's gone from under 4% of young men saying they were attending church in 2018 to these latest statistics from the last year saying that it's up to 21%. Now, that's a five-fold increase. Now, you may not see that as like young men flooding into the doors of churches, but it does reflect what I've been hearing up and down the country from church leaders saying, we're just seeing a lot of young guys turning up. They maybe read the Bible, they've maybe bumped into videos by Jordan Peterson, they've got all these questions, but they're looking for something and they're turning up in church. And it's the demographic that traditionally has been most absent from churches, interestingly. So it's a really, really interesting new thing that's happening.
There is, of course, another religion that is growing quite fast in Britain, and that is Islam. Do you think this sort of latching onto a Christian identity, and I don't mean this cynically, I agree with you, I think it's a good thing. But do you think this latching onto a Christian identity is perhaps a response to this sense that Islam is more of a prominent feature in public life and people want to reclaim what they regard as their religion? People of Britain want to reclaim Christianity as an English religion.
I think there is, and that's definitely a component of it. And even people like Richard Dawkins, the arch atheist, has sort of slightly reclaimed his cultural Christianity in the face of what he sees as the dangers of Islam sort of encroaching on British culture. That's going on. And to be honest, I think there's all kinds of mixed motives why people are turning up in church or looking at faith again. And one of them is undoubtedly the fact that some people are wondering, well, what is my culture? And it turns out that, a lot of these secular intellectuals are saying to people, well, if you're looking for the foundations of Western civilization, you need to look at the Bible again. You need to look at the Judeo-Christian heritage. You've got things like the Ark Conference in London, which I was at a couple of months ago, which are all about basically saying secular humanism can't provide the foundations. It's got to be this Judeo-Christian story. Now, there may be some cynical political, cultural motivations going on in people who want to reclaim that kind of identity. But I think actually, as a Christian, I believe God can sort of sort the wheat from the weeds, and in the end I think it's often a catalyst, it's often a door by which people will bump into the real thing, whether they came for sort of slightly political motivations or not. I think a lot of these people are discovering the true God, the true Jesus in the process.
You mentioned Jordan Peterson, whose views on Christianity are kind of interesting but hard to grasp. But it does seem as though the trend, there's a sort of intellectual trend, a mass market intellectual trend towards religion, in the same way that there was against religion with the new atheists in the noughties. Think of Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens. The trend has gone in the opposite direction in recent years.
Yeah, and I think one of the big things, especially when it comes to young people, is that Gen Z, these sort of 18 to 20 somethings, they never experienced the new atheism. They were still in nappies in the noughties, and they just don't have the same religious baggage that the Gen Xers and millennials and boomers have. And it's noticeable that those new atheists, the Dawkins, the Hitchens, the Harrises, they were all of that sort of boomer / sort of Gen X kind of generation. And they had something to kick against. They had sort of the Christianity that sort of was around them when they were growing up. They had sort of a sense that they needed to shed something. That's not the case with Gen Z. That they just haven't really grown up in a Christian culture. They don't really have any thing to kick against. I mean, interestingly, Nick Cave put it to me this way when talking about his Gen Z son. He said, the thing is that they say to me, atheism is boring. Kind of that's what my parents were. It's what my grandparents may have been. The edgy thing, the interesting thing is now religion. It's actually doing something that's different to what everyone else is currently doing. So I think there's a kind of an interesting switch that's happened where actually people are kind of ready to take it seriously again, because actually, they haven't got any sort of baggage to kick against.
And it's interesting that church going in particular is on the rise, because that requires some rigor, some discipline. It's not just something you can, just say you're interested in. You actually have to make a commitment to go, and you start going regularly.
Absolutely. And the way that Tom Holland, the historian, put it to me in a conversation about a year ago was, Christians, if they want to attract people, they need to keep Christianity weird, rather than sort of backpedaling on the demands of Christianity and the strangeness of Christianity. Actually major on it, because that's actually what people are looking for. They're not looking for a sort of warmed over secular humanism with a bit of God sprinkled on top. They're not looking for the same sort of stuff they can already get in the culture at the moment. They are looking for something weird, that's a bit demanding, that's challenging, that you're not necessarily going to understand from the moment you walk in. That's why Tom Holland, when he goes to church, goes to St. Bartholomew the Great, London's oldest church, full of mystery, meaning, these sort of very grand liturgical services. And they are, rather befuddling and confusing probably to the average person, but they're also somewhat interesting and enchanting. And I think that's what's drawing people. It's and even the ethical challenge, in many churches of Christianity, I think, especially these young men, they're looking for something to get their teeth stuck into, and actually it feels like this is more interesting than what's on offer at the moment in secular culture.
And if you like weirdness, and I should reveal a bias here, Roman Catholicism is a pretty good church to be in. And I read in the Catholic Herald the other day that Catholicism is overtaking Anglicanism in Britain. That's from the same study, is it?
That's right. That was specifically among young people, that more young people are now turning up to Catholic services than to, say, Anglican services on average. And again, I think it does reflect this fact that they're looking for something a bit different, a bit weird, as you say. And yeah, the Catholic Church, majors in a sense on the ancient, on rituals that may not be immediately apparent. And they really haven't changed that much in terms of the ethical demands that they place on people in terms of the way they live their life. And so I think, interestingly, it's churches that have to some extent held the line, that haven't sort of collapsed into just sort of accommodating everything that now exists in the culture, that are actually now seeing the benefits of that. I think the churches that have essentially just said, we want to look as much like the culture as possible, the problem is they've become invisible. If you don't have something that looks different, people aren't going to notice you any longer. And it's those churches that are suffering. And it's those sort of squishy churches in the middle that really aren't saying or doing anything different to what's already available, that I think are attracting the least number of these new people, these new meaning seekers who are looking for a better story.
And are we seeing this among evangelicals too? I mean, an important point about Catholicism is it hasn't accepted gay marriage. And that is appealing to young people who are looking for something different from the culture they're in.
I think there's an argument to say that's true. I mean, it's generally been true even before this report came out that on average in the UK, evangelical churches have tended to hold up better than liberal, progressive, mainline kind of churches where perhaps they have accepted gay marriage and lots of those sorts of things. So that's already been the story. Interestingly, the report alongside Catholicism shows that Pentecostalism is also a place where you're seeing the most growth among young people. And that's obviously a place where, yes, there would be naturally a kind of more conservative ethic around marriage and sexuality. But it's also the place where you get another kind of weirdness that's a bit different to the Catholic weirdness. It's the supernatural weirdness. It's the speaking in tongues. It's the visions. It's the prophecies. And again, I think there's a lot of openness to that, especially among young people. You look online now, on TikTok or wherever, people are not sort of these rational scientific atheists by any stretch. They are into witch talk and crystals and manifesting. They're very open to the supernatural is the point. And so in a sense, why wouldn't they be open to the supernatural aspect of Christianity? And I think that's why you're seeing, again, this boom in both ends of the church, the high church, the liturgical, traditional kind of Catholicism, but also that kind of happy, clappy, speaking in tongues Pentecostalism. It's actually very attractive. The weirdness of that is also attracting young people.
And lastly, to go back to our original point about the overwhelming trend being one of decline, how quickly would this revival need to happen to start saving parishes? Because, I mean, if you look at churches institutionally, they're still closing churches. They're still in very much in decline mode.
Well, this is the problem, is that the report, while it's generally good news for church going overall, it wasn't necessarily that good news for Anglicanism. And of course, Anglicanism is where the parish system really exists in the UK. And the problem is that a lot of the centres where there is actual growth in the Anglican church tend to be in urban centres with lots of immigrant populations, especially, and lots of young people. They don't tend to be in the rural areas where, it's the Gen Xers and the boomers who kind of aren't so interested in religion, where they're gathering. So my parents, they go to a wonderful 12th century Anglican church in their local village, but there's just a handful of them gathering, and they're just trying to keep the lights on, basically. And I don't think this sort of what we're seeing in this quiet revival is necessarily going to be the saving grace for those kinds of places. They still face huge challenges to try and keep those doors open and those parish churches alive. I just want to say to anyone who's in that position, though, hold the line. These are extraordinary buildings, extraordinary places that have been infused with worship and prayer and community for generations upon generations. I do think if we can keep them open just long enough, we may see this turning of the tide, even in those places that are more these rural areas, that you might be able to see new communities flourishing and thriving even there.
And presumably the really important ingredient would be more vocations to the priesthood for all Christian churches.
Absolutely. I mean, it's a vicious circle, isn't it? The less people who go to church, the less people you're likely to find who are putting themselves forward for ordination. And then, the less people you have serving in that role, the less churches can actually, do their job of ministry into local churches and parishes and so on. So I think this will be good, the fact that young people especially are returning to church. What we really want, I mean, there's been a real move in recent years towards people in later life going forward for ordination, and that's great. But the problem is you're pouring a lot of money and energy into people who frankly aren't going to have that many years to actually serve in churches. What churches really need to do is attract young ordinands, people who are at the beginning who have the real energy to be able to go in with the most fruitful, most energetic years of their life. And my hope is that we'll see that as people start to re-engage church, re-engage the Christian story. These Gen Z will be, if you like, the next generation of parish priests, ministers, pastors, and whatever.
Justin, thank you very much for coming on Spectator TV, and have a very happy Easter.
Thank you very much. Great to be with you.